Welcome to Lesson 15 of our continuing examination of the book of Daniel, in a study that I have called The Daniel Factor in the Fullness of Time, a study in which we have been exploring just how the book of Daniel factors into God's overall plan to bring about humanity's ultimate redemption and restoration through the seed of the woman, as he first promised way back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, and then began to actually providentially orchestrate, beginning with the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and will ultimately conclude when Jesus returns to set up his earthly kingdom here on earth. My name is Bruce Logan, and in today's study, we will be looking at Daniel chapter 10. And in Daniel chapter 10, we will be seeing the final vision that's recorded in the book of Daniel. In fact, the final three chapters of Daniel, chapters 10, chapters 11, and chapter 12, all go together as one vision. And Daniel, as in the previous three visions, will receive the interpretation by a heavenly angel. Now, in this final section, we will see three things that God will reveal to Daniel by giving him even more progressive details about previous prophecies. First of all, we're going to get a glimpse of the near future of the nation of Israel, or additional layers of detail about events surrounding Antiochus Epiphanes, whom we were first introduced to earlier in Daniel chapter 8. Then we will be seeing more progressive details about Israel's far distant future and events relating to the time of the Antichrist, by the way, on which Antiochus was a type of, or he was a type of the Antichrist. And finally, and even more importantly, in this final section, we're going to get a glimpse into the dark side, or that invisible or that unseen world, and we're going to get a first-hand glimpse, or a first-hand lesson that we are not battling against flesh and blood, as the Apostle Paul pointed out in his epistle to the church of Ephesus, but instead we are in a battle, or a spiritual battle, with principalities and rulers of darkness. And chapter 10 gives us a peek into the heart of this unseen realm, or this unseen spiritual warfare. In other words, we're going to see that there is a war going on in the unseen realm that literally impacts much of what we see occurring in the natural realm, or more simply put, much of what we see happening in the natural world, especially when it comes to geopolitical events and affairs, was first orchestrated in the spiritual realm before it was ever manifested in the natural. So I hope you enjoy this study, and let's get into it. Before we get into today's lesson, I need to mention that if you would like more information about our ministry and more information about some of the things that we have taught, or the teachings that we do, or how to get in touch with us, you can reach out to me, or you can check me out at my webpage at www.drbrucelogan.com or bruceloganministries.com. You can also follow me on Facebook at DBL Ministries. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Bruce Logan 1. That's Dr. Bruce Logan 1 on Twitter. And you can also email me at br2logan@aol.com. And of course, you want to remind you that if you would like to receive notifications about whenever a new video comes online, I would like to encourage you to just click the like button and click the bell in order to be reminded when the next lesson of this series will be made available. Now, as I begin to unpack this final vision of the book of Daniel, I need to just mention, by way of review, that the previous visions that Daniel had been receiving, including going all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 that Daniel interpreted, God was primarily focusing on not exclusively, but mostly, he was focusing on the rise and fall of world Gentile empires and how those empires would eventually impact or affect the nation of Israel. But beginning in chapter 10 and this final vision, um, God is going to switch his focus to the nation of Israel, or his primary emphasis, I should say, will be switched and focused on the nation of Israel and their near and distant future, and how the rise and fall of the empires that was mentioned previously, especially the final empire of Rome, will impact the nation of Israel going forward. And again, as I mentioned, their are near and their far distant future. Now, with that, if you recall the study that we did for Daniel chapter 7, I introduced a term in biblical theology known as progressive revelation. And just simply put, what we mean by the term progressive revelation, it is a discipline within biblical theology which studies the Bible from the perspective of recognizing and understanding the progressive history of God revealing himself to humanity following the fall and throughout the Old and the New Testament in successive or progressive stages, with each stage, and get this, building upon the previous stage in order to understand how each succeeding stage ultimately points forward to the ultimate fulfillment of God establishing Christ's kingdom on earth and man being restored back to his state before the fall. Now, to put that more succinctly, or just state it more simply, with the concept of progressive revelation, God progressively reveals new truth over time, which supports, adds to, and expands upon previous revelations of God's truth. So basically, what does all that mean? In the book of Daniel, we've been studying beginning with chapter 2, then again in chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, and now again, as we get here into chapters 10, 11, and 12, God has given or revealed a series of prophecies or visions about the future. Some of those prophecies have been fulfilled in actual real-time history, and others are remaining to be fulfilled at some point in the future. But during the course of these prophecies, each one of the visions, beginning with chapter 2, and then again in chapter 7, again in chapter 8, again in chapter 9, and now with this final vision in chapter 10, 11, and 12, God is going to reveal additional details or more progressive details that supports, adds to, and expand upon the visions that was received in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9. And so basically, that's kind of the overview of what we mean by progressive revelation. And if you want to get more or just kind of grasp that more, you can go back and check out our study that we did in Daniel chapter 7, in which I talk about this in a little bit more detail. But for this sake, as we get into this final vision, God is now progressively revealing. He's adding and supporting and giving more details about the visions that he has already given in chapter, and more specifically in chapter 7, 8, and 9. And so we're going to see that clearly. And mind you, God is adding layers of detail. But he in this case, he's adding layers of detail more specifically that concern the future, and this is very important, that concern the future of the nation of Israel. Now, keeping that in mind, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, Daniel chapters 10 through 12 form one vision, or the final vision that is recorded in the book of Daniel. Chapter 10 is the introduction and the preparation for this ultimate or this final vision in Daniel. Chapter 11 is the main body of the vision, which has three separate components to it. The first being it's going to point out events from Israel's immediate future to Antiochus Epiphanes that we, again, first was introduced to in Daniel chapter 8. The second part of it is going to take us from Antiochus to the Antichrist, who, again, we learned about in Daniel chapter 7 with the little horn rising out of the 10-nation confederacy. And we also learned about it, some more revealed details in chapter 9 in the vision of the 70 weeks. And we've seen the Antichrist is going to sign a future peace treaty for 7 years, and in the middle of that period, or at about the 3.5-year mark, is going to break the treaty and set up the abomination of desolation that Jesus spoke about in his Olivet Discourse. And then finally, the vision is going to go from the Antichrist to the return of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And then lastly, in chapter 12, we're going to see the consummation or the final days of the prophecy. So from chapter 10 through 12, again, form one vision, and it's going to be introduced these three concepts: the introduction and preparation, the main body of the prophecy, and the consummation or the final days, which is will be recorded in Daniel chapter 12. Now, as we take a look at an outline for Daniel chapter 10, we're going to see that Daniel 10, while it may be the shortest chapter in the book of Daniel, it contains one of the more amazing reveals that we will discover in the entirety of the Old Testament. And we'll get to that in a moment. But in Daniel 10, the outline goes something like this. It starts out in Daniel chapter 10, verses 1 through 3 with Daniel in mourning. And we'll talk about why he was in mourning here in a moment. And Daniel then goes on to see a vision in verses 4 through 9. And then finally, the heavenly messenger comes to Daniel with the purpose of the vision. And we're going to get that incredible reveal that I mentioned just a moment ago. And we'll see that in verses 10 through 21. And of course, when we jump into chapter 12 next week, we'll see the interpretation of the vision that's going to be given in chapter 11. So now, beginning with Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, we read, "In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision." Verse 2, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled." Now, I need to stick a pin here just to give a little bit of chronological context to what we just read in the first 3 verses. Now, first of all, it starts out by telling us that it was the 3rd year of King Cyrus, or the 3rd year that after the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire on that famous night in Daniel chapter 5 of the handwriting on the wall. So this is now 3 years later, and the Jews had, or Cyrus rather, had issued a decree, or that famous decree that's recorded in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, that allowed the Jews to return back to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. And this decree had been given 2 years earlier in 536 BC by Cyrus, as you can read in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, as I mentioned. Now, apparently, Daniel did not leave with the other exiles who was allowed 2 years earlier to return to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding the temple. And so it says that Daniel was mourning during this period of time. And it could be, and of course, scholars debate and historians debate as to why Daniel didn't return. Some theorize that because Daniel was well into his 80s by this time, maybe, in fact, approaching 90 years old by this time. And, just for someone of his age to make such an arduous journey across, a burning desert over 500 miles would have not been a practical thing for him to do. And some also theorize that, as you can recall, that Daniel was a significant administrator in both the Babylonian and the Persian Empire. And it could be that Daniel was such an important administrator in spite of his age that maybe Cyrus felt like he could not afford to allow Daniel to return because of his value that he had to the state. Or it could have been a combination of the two. We don't really know for certain, but we do know that Daniel remained in Babylon for the remainder of his life and never returned back to Jerusalem, even though the 70-year exile period had concluded. So verse 4 says, "And in the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel," which, by the way, was actually the Tigris River. In verse 5, "Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Upas. His body also was like beryl, and his face was like the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like the color of polished brass." So let's just stop for a moment and review this description of this heavenly messenger, and notice the description that was given to him by Daniel in verses 5 and 6. It first says that he was clothed in linen. And then it says his loins were girded with fine gold and Upas. His body was also like the beryl, his face as the appearance of lightning, his eyes as lamps of fire, his arms and his feet were like the color of polished brass, and the voice of his words was like the voice of a multitude. Now, different people do have debates about who this heavenly messenger was, but if you forget about all the debates rather, and just look at this description. This description is very similar to the description given in the book of Revelation by the Apostle John of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so many theorize that this was an incarnate appearance of the Old Testament appearance, rather, of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And it's hard to argue against that when you just examine and compare and contrast this description with the description given by the Apostle John in the book of Revelations. And so this is very likely an incarnate appearance of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, which we often use the term a theophany. A theophany is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ, and this is likely a perfect example of a theophany that Daniel receives here. And again, he is giving Daniel, but now, I forgot, I need to pause. I need to just take a moment to pause here, because we're going to see, and I don't want to just give it away right now, but we'll see here in a moment the argument, and it's a legitimate argument, and I want to point it out once we get to it, but it's a legitimate argument as to why many believe that this could not have been the incarnate Christ, because we're going to learn that it was he's going to reveal to Daniel rather that the prince of Persia withheld him for 21 days. Now you would think that if this was an actual incarnate appearance of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that the prince of Persia could not have withstood him 21 seconds, let alone 21 days. And that is a legitimate argument that we'll discuss here in just a moment. So in verse 7 it says, "And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone, and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me, for my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet heard I the voice of his words, and when I heard the voice of his words, then I was in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. And behold, a hand touched me, which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands." Verse 11, "And he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved." Notice these words. And again, I just wanted to point this out because, again, we see another example here of the incredible character of this man Daniel, where a heavenly messenger is saying that he is greatly beloved. Now, being that this is coming from a heavenly messenger, this is basically saying that Daniel was greatly beloved in heaven itself. "Now, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto you, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent." And when he had spoken these words unto me, I stood trembling. Verse 12, "Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words." Now, what is revealed next is what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned the fact that we're going to see one of the most amazing reveals in the entirety of the Old Testament. Because what happens next, or what's revealed next, is the fact that we're going to see directly into the unseen realm, or into the spirit realm, in which the unseen forces and unseen heavenly as well as demonic forces are at war, that's orchestrating and controlling what actually happens, or what's actually manifested here on earth. In other words, we as human beings are preoccupied by what we can see with our natural eyes, and what we experience by our natural human senses of our sight, sound, taste, touch, and what we can experience here in the natural. And this concept that there are forces and that there is activity happening all around in the unseen world that we cannot see with our natural senses is something that's foreign to most of us. But even though it's foreign to most of us, and incomprehensible to many of us, that yet and still, what we're going to learn here as we study chapter 10, that what's happening in the unseen realm, and I want to just emphasize this, what is happening in the unseen or the spiritual realm is just as real and just as impactful and just as influential as we see in the natural realm. So in verse 12, this messenger had informed Daniel that from the very first day that Daniel began to pray, that his words were heard, and this messenger was sent to Daniel for his words. But notice what he says in verse 13. "Now And remember, he was dispatched from day one, or the first day that Daniel began to pray. But notice what he says in 13. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 1 and 21 days, or 1 and 20 days, or 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings, plural, of Persia for 21 days. And so again, this is so many things that are layered here just in this one verse. Of course, we're seeing this spiritual battle that's literally happening in the unseen realm, but also we're seeing that this messenger was there for 21 days. And if you notice, it says he remained there for those 21 days with the kings of Persia. Now, when we talk about the king of Persia and the kings of Persia, and we also have the character introduced, the Michael, one of the chief princes. All of these are spiritual manifestations of the warfare that's happening in the unseen realm. So again, what we have here is we have a glimpse of the spiritual warfare or the unseen battles that are influencing and impacting what is happening in the natural realm. And if we just take a pause here and let's just consider this, because there is so much happening in our world today, especially when it comes to geopolitical affairs. There's so much happening that we need to kind of wrap our minds around the fact that as believers, because carnal-minded people, unsaved people, will never be able to grasp this concept. But the fact is that while most people in the natural are preoccupied with personality politics or what's happening in the natural realm, but there are spiritual forces, and we're going to get into this because it's very important. I need to lay this out. There are spiritual forces, there are unseen forces that are impacting what's happening in the world. And as believers, we have to be able to have discernment. We have to be able to discern that what people in the world are seeing is not what's really happening. And we have to be able to discern that. And anytime we as believers have the same worldview, the same perspective on things that's happening in the world as the unbeliever, then we need to take a pause, take a step back and check ourselves, check our thinking, check our theology, check our level of discernment, because we need to have a different level of understanding of what's happening in the world than someone who is unsaved. And we are able to get a bird's eye glimpse and a much better understanding of what is literally manifesting in the natural realm by understanding the prophecies in Daniel and also understanding this concept of spiritual warfare in the unseen realm and how this spiritual warfare is impacting and influencing what's happening in the natural realm. Notice, for example, this famous passage in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 by the Apostle Paul, where he records this spiritual battle that's happening in the unseen realm when he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places." That's Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. And in Daniel, we not only read the words, or when we look at Daniel, not only do we have this verse as a point of reference, but we also actually see a bird's eye view directly into this spiritual battle that's going on all around us in the unseen realm. So now let's just go back to verse 13 and just take a look again at what this heavenly messenger said about this unseen battle in chapter 10 and verse 13. Notice again what was said. He said, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia." the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 1 and 20 days, or 21 days. Now, first of all, you have to remember and just think about it. You don't even need a lot of theological background to be able to understand. All you really need to be able to do is read the words of the text in order to really get somewhat of an idea that when it's referring to the prince of the kingdom of Persia, it obviously could not be talking about a human individual, because there is no possible way that any kind of human individual would be able to withstand for 21 seconds, let alone 21 days, a heavenly messenger. Now, notice it says again that the prince of the kingdom of Persia, which is obviously, a spiritual being, withstood me 1 and 20 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, or one of the chief princes of Israel, to be more specific, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. So now, the question that we have to stop here and begin to ask and to begin uh, to examine is, who exactly is this prince of the kingdom of Persia? Who exactly is that? Now, it is a very complex and detailed question to answer that I'm going to just try to touch on, because it's a study that can take up an entire lesson in and of itself. But in order to answer the question, we first have to take a look at something that Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. And I'm uh, reading in the ESV, and it says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. Let me start that again. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. And verse 9 says, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotment. So now there is a lot there, and that the average person will probably read that and just continue to read, and it may not really mean anything to them. So let me just go back and look at that again. When the Most High gave to the nation their inheritance, when he divided mankind, Now, when did God divide mankind? And the obvious answer to that question is, of course, at the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 10. He fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Now, in the King James Version and many other versions, that verse or that phrase, according to the number of the sons of God, actually says according to the number of the sons of, or the children of Israel. But we know that when the Babel account happened, there was no Israel, there was no nation of Israel, and and there was a discovery of Deuteronomy among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is actually translated the number of the sons of God. So now the question has to be asked: who were the sons of God? And while again, like I said, this could be a very detailed study of who were the sons of God. But of course, if you just remember the account of the flood in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, it mentions that the sons of God and came and had relations with human women. And long story short, every time the term the sons of God is used in the Old Testament, it's always referring to angelic beings, heavenly beings. And it says, according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotment. So what happened at the flood, or after the flood in the Tower of Babel? Of course, we know the story in which God wanted the people multiply and replenish the entire earth after the flood, but instead they gathered and congregated in one place in the land of Shinar, and they tried to build a tower up to heaven. God came down and dispersed them and confused the languages, and all the people and all the people that had the same language, the same ethnicity, kind of went together, and we have what was referred to as the Table of Nations, and there were 70 nations that's recorded in the Table of Nations in the book of Genesis. In the post Tower of Babel account, the Table of Nations, and there were 70 nations that's recorded, and according to this passage in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, that each one of the 70 nations, there was a corresponding angelic being that was assigned over these nations, over these 70 nations. But God said he would reserve Jacob as his personal heritage or his personal allotment. And of course, this was before the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, which will give us some insight into the fact that once God had separated the nations and divided the nations, and then gave every nation, or gave the sons of God their inheritance, and put them rulers over different groups of human beings, then God raised up and called out a man amongst himself by the name of Abraham, and he would eventually make Abraham his heritage or his allotment. So again, let's look at, and I'm just giving a very brief overview into this study, but in Genesis chapter 10 verses 5 and verses 32, verse 5 says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." In verse 32, it says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." And of course, every one of these divided nations, and of course, if you go back and track the Table of Nations that's recorded in this Genesis 10 account, that you will discover that, as according to, and you compare and contrast that, by the way, with what we have here in Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, and several other passages, that there was an angelic being who was given authority and rulership over each one of these separate nations. And their main responsibility was going to be to kind of steer these nations into the right path. But obviously, these angelic beings turned out to be corrupt, and of course, this is just a small portion of this study. It goes in much more detail, but the point that I'm trying to make, that many of most of them, in fact, all of these fallen angels that they would later become, led all the various nations astray, and they were the rulers over these nations, and they were the rulers over all of these Gentile world nations that was divided after the Tower of Babel. That when God dispersed the languages, and he did it according to the number of the sons of God. So that was just a very brief, very short explanation. And when we're referring to the king of Persia, and in other words, the demonic spirit, or the angelic, or the fallen angelic being that's ruler over the nation of Persia, or the rise of Persia, the Persian Empire. That this particular person was the one that withstood the messenger for 21 days, and it occurred in the heavenly realm. And it also gives us insight into the fact that if you examine history of what happened with the Persian Empire, that this heavenly this unseen spirit, unseen deity that was responsible for the rise of the Persian Empire was later going to be defeated, as we're going to see, and by the angelic being that's going to come over the Greek Empire, that we're going to see that. In other words, just said all that to say that all of this historical events that we know from history, it all literally occurred in real time, but there was an angelic being, there was unseen forces, unseen spiritual warfare that was taking place in the unseen realm that was later manifested in the natural. And the exact same thing is happening in our world today, especially when it comes to geopolitical events and affairs. And so that's something that's very important to keep in mind as, when we go through, this very difficult time and period in, with the inflation and everything that's happening in the world right now. We need to understand that none of the things that are happening by accident, but everything that's occurring in the world right now, especially again, as I continue to reiterate, especially when it concerns anything dealing geopolitically, is being orchestrated in the spirit realm before it is manifested in the natural realm. So again, just by way of review, we're talking about who was this king of Persia. In Genesis chapter 10, which is commonly known as the Table of Nations, is a list of the patriarchal founders of 70 nations, which descended from Noah through his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, 26 of these nations, of the 70 nations, descended from Shem, which of course the Jewish descendants from Shem. 30 from Ham, and 14 from Japheth. Now, again, each one of these nations had a corresponding spiritual being in control in the unseen realm over the corresponding nation that they were assigned to by God himself. So in other words, God himself assigned a spiritual being to be authority or over these 70 nations, but God set aside a nation that had not even been born yet, or a person that had not been born yet, by the name of Abraham. And he set him up as his portion or his inheritance. And of course, which is why he made the insistence that he didn't want any other God before him, that he was going to be their God, and how he raised them up and gave them laws and so on and so forth. Because, oh, and by the way, I need to mention, because it was God's ultimate plan to bring forth the Messiah through his portion, which was going to be the nation of Israel. Now, in this map that I have here on the screen, you can see just a brief kind of an overview of this table of nations and where all the various tribes and various nations and ethnicities migrated to, according to their language and according to their ethnicity. And you can see that each and every one of these had a corresponding demonic or satanic spirit that was ruling over them in the unseen realm. And of course, there's so much that you can get from this, from history, because what we found out and what happens over time is that each one of these corresponding angelic beings that fail to keep out their assignment of steering their prospective territory to the worship of the one true God. They instead had that worship given to them instead, which is another reason why, God, was insistent that the Jews and his portion of people would never have any other God before him. So that's an important little narrative to kind of keep in mind as if you got into any type of in-depth Old Testament study. And now there are a number of examples, biblically speaking, that we can refer to um, when it comes to explaining and pointing out this idea of spiritual beings in the unseen realm ruling over nations of men. But one of the more popular examples is Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 19. And it says, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyre. And of course, notice that phrase, the king of Tyre. But then it goes on to give a description of this king of Tyre. And just right off the bat, you will notice that this description cannot apply to any human individual. So just take a look. It says, say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealed up the sum full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So just like right there, perfect in beauty, obviously he was not talking about a human individual, or more than likely was not. But then verse 13 really gives it away. It says, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. So obviously this was not referring to any natural individual. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold, the workmanship of thy tabrets and thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou was created. And of course, not only this description of a deity or entity that was absolutely not human or natural, but it also goes on to say that this, in addition to being so beautiful and having all of these fineries, that apparently this entity was a skilled musician, which is one of the reasons why many argue that Satan led worship in heaven. We can't really say that 100% certain, for 100% certainty rather, but this description is where that idea comes from. Verse 14 says, Thou art the anointed cherub that covers, and I have set thee so. And God said, I have set thee so. And it describes him as the anointed cherub that covers. And of course, obviously, that's another description that cannot be referring to any natural human individual. So it's obviously referring to an unseen or spiritual individual, this king of Tyre. Thou was upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down the midst of the stones of fire. Obviously, again, cannot be anything human or anybody human. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise, they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore, I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God. Again, obviously not a human individual. And I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, and they may behold thee. Thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities, by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee. It shall devour thee, and I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold thee. Again, talking about the prince of Tyre, or the demonic spirit over the kingdom of Tyre. And they that know thee among the people shall be astonished at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt thou be any more. And so, again, this prince of Tyre, this king of Tyre, is obviously speaking about the angelic deity that was over the nation of Tyre, and it could not have been a specific individual or human individual. Now, that was just a brief overview of this idea of the unseen realm and the spiritual deities that's over the kingdom of human beings, that's over nations, that was assigned to the nations by God himself after the Tower of Babel. And we can see again, the thing that makes this important that we have to keep in mind is the fact, or the main thing that we need to keep in mind and understand is that nothing, and I repeat, nothing that's happening in the world from the big picture standpoint, especially when it comes to issues pertaining to geopolitical issues, nations, culture, what's happening in society with the culture, and none of this is happening by accident. It is all being orchestrated. Everything with the economies, with the national economy, with world economies, it's all being orchestrated for a specific set purpose. And as believers, we need to be able to wrap our minds around that, because we're going to have to be able to raise our level of discernment in these days, because if we basically just listen and get all of our information from the mainstream media, we're going to be woefully underinformed. And so as believers, we need to, again, raise our level of discernment, and there is no better way to do that than studying the book of Daniel. So again, so now let's just get back into our text in chapter 10 and begin back here at verse 14. And it says, now I am come to, and this is this heavenly messenger that coming to that fought for 21 days, that was dispatched from the very first day that Daniel began to pray, but was withheld for 21 days and received help from Michael, the chief prince of Israel. And now he has made it, and he's presented himself to Daniel. And now it says here in verse 14, now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. Verse 15, and when he had spoken such words unto me, I set my face toward the ground, and I became dumb. And behold, one like the similitude of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, and said unto him that stood before me, O my Lord, by the vision my sorrows are turned upon me, and I have retained no strength. For how can the servant of this my Lord talk with this my Lord? As for me, straightway there remain no strength in me, neither is there breath left in me. Then there came again and touched me one like the appearance of a man, and he strengthened me, and said, O man greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto thee. Be strong, yea, be strong. And when he had spoken unto me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak, for thou hast strengthened me. Then said he, Know thou wherefore I come unto thee, and now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. And of course, I need to stick a pin right here. because I need to remind you that we have learned from the previous visions that Daniel received, and even going back to the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2, that the prophecies were relating to the rise and the fall of world empires. Of course, we already know that Babylon had fallen and had been taken over by the Persians. The Persians were currently in power, but we also know, because of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, and especially the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 of the ram and the he-goat, that the Persians was going to eventually be defeated by the Greeks led by Alexander the Great. And of course, when he says, when I go back to fight against the prince of Persia, and he mentions that the prince of Greece will come, he was not specifically talking about Alexander, but he was talking about the spirit, or the satanic spirit, that was ruling and controlling and raising up the Greek Empire, and that would eventually be responsible for leading this young Alexander to defeat the Persian Empire in 332 BC. So now, again, we see again that this is a spiritual battle, the spiritual warfare that's really controlling what's happening in the natural here on earth. Verse 21 says, "But I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that holds with me in these things but Michael your prince." Now, I would just like to conclude this first part of this final vision of the book of Daniel, which we have here in Daniel chapter 10, by pointing out another very famous example or Old Testament illustration of just how impactful this, or how real rather, this war between the spiritual war that's occurring in the heavenlies, and how it is impacting events here on earth. And that is this account in 2 Kings chapter 6 and verses 8 through 23. And I just want to just run through this real quick. It's a very, very familiar story, but I just want to point it out because it really graphically illustrates this unseen battle that's taking place. In verse 8 it says, "Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, My camp will be in such and such a place. And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there. Then the king of Israel sent someone to the place of which the man of God had told him, and thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice. Therefore, the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? In other words, he was assuming that because the king of Israel had set up and knew exactly where he was going to be, or where he was planning to be, that apparently he must have had some sort of human spy in his camp that was reporting back to the king of Israel. And one of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. So he said, Go and see where he is, that I may send and get him. And it was told him, saying, Surely he is in Dothan. Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came up by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose, when Elijah's servant arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? And he answered, Do not fear, and this is this famous line, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And of course, you can see here clearly in this narrative that there were unseen forces or an unseen heavenly army that came to protect Elisha. And again, it's all a part of this overall narrative that in the unseen realm, there is activity that's happening all around us every day that's dictating and controlling and orchestrating events that are happening here on earth in the natural. Now, as I conclude this study of Daniel 10, I would just like to take a moment and briefly go back and review one particular verse that I sort of feel that encapsulates this entire idea of the spiritual warfare that's taking place in the unseen realm that deals with spiritual beings and entities that have authority over nations and government and that control the dictates of individual nations and governments. And that overview can be seen in verse 20. So let's go back and take a look at verse 20 and notice what it says. Then said he, know thou wherefore I come unto thee, and now I will return to fight with the prince of Persia. And again, he's going back to fight with that spiritual being, a spiritual entity that's has authority over the Persian Empire. And then it says, and when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. And that is very interesting because as we know from our study in Daniel chapter 8, that currently the Persian Empire is in power, but eventually the Greek Empire will conquer the Persian Empire. And that literally took place in 332 AD when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. And again, there was a demonic spirit, or the prince of Grecia, that was operating in the unseen realm, controlling the affairs of the kingdom and the nation and the empire of Greece. And from their very early beginnings, because you got to remember, when this verse was given to Daniel, there was no Greek Empire. There was no Alexander. There was no Hellenistic age. There was none of that. Greece at the time was just a collection of city-states that fought against each other more than they fought against their enemies or their outside enemies. They fought more against each other. But during all this time, there was a force, there was an unseen spiritual being that was in control over the kingdom of Greece that would eventually allow these warring independent little city-states that comprise the country of Greece to unify into one force that will eventually go on to conquer the Persian Empire. And again, all of this activity would be occurring in the unseen realm. And it's very important to understand that as we begin to try to understand the geopolitical climate of today's world. And that's very important because we have to understand that there is nothing that's happening in today's world that's happening by accident or by just by happenstance. Everything that's occurring in today's world, especially when it relates to anything geopolitically, we have to understand that it is happening on purpose, and it is controlled by, or being controlled by, unseen forces that are impacting the events that we have seeing unfold here on earth. And I want to reiterate this, is that if you as a believer get your understanding of what's happening in the world today from the mainstream media narratives, then I have to tell you that you will be woefully underinformed, and you will not be able to really be able to discern what's really happening in the world. Because if you get your understanding of what's happening in the world from carnal people, from people who are unable to understand spiritual things, and then as a believer, you will likewise, be woefully undiscerning about what's happening in the world and in the climate around us. And I just want to point out, because there's one, and I could give you many examples of this. But there is one particular example that I just want to close out by highlighting, that's very prominent and that's coming to rise and more prominence in today's world. And that is this idea of the economic great reset. And you have to understand that this economic great reset is actually being orchestrated by what I like to refer to the term in the biblical, the Bible uses the term, the spirit of Antichrist. The spirit of Antichrist, because you have to keep in mind the ultimate goal of the Antichrist, if we get into that in the book of Revelations, is going to be to bring about a one world government, a one world economic system, and a one world religion. And there are two things that I want to point out that's hindering this Antichrist, spirit of Antichrist movement from orchestrating and bringing about this one world government type system. And those two things, of course, number one is the Church of Jesus Christ. The Church of Jesus Christ is the number one hindrance to bringing about this spirit of Antichrist, because you got to remember, this spirit of Antichrist is everything that's against God. So if you're a believer, for an example, and you believe that the marriage is between a man and a woman, and that there are only two genders, and you believe that God made them male and female, created he them, and if you believe that, then you are a hindrance, you're a stumbling block in the way of this Antichrist spirit to be able to fully bring about its agenda. But the second thing is, and this is the one that's probably has gone under the radar, where most people who, if you get your understanding of geopolitical affairs from the mainstream media, you will not be able to pick up on this. And that's the reason why I want to just emphasize this one last point, is that first you have the Church of Jesus Christ is the number one stumbling block, or the hindrance is keeping the spirit of Antichrist from having its way. But the second thing is the United States of America. Now, I know that some of you may cringe, some of you who are maybe on the left, you're going to cringe at that statement, but I want you just to hear me out. And then also, I don't want you to just accept what I'm saying in this comment, but I want you to be able to go back and research what I'm saying. Hold your opinion, research what I'm saying, and be a Berean. Go back and search to see whether or not the things that I'm actually saying has any truth or validity to it. And the reason why I said that the United States of America is the second most hindering force that's stopping the movement or the full escalation of the spirit of Antichrist in the world, to bring about this one world government, this one world economic system. And that is because even in spite of all of the past several years economic difficulties, the United States still remains the number one economic power in the world. And by the United States being the number one economic power in the world, it is hindering the Antichrist spirit, because in order for the Antichrist spirit to bring about a one world economic system, that Antichrist spirit is going to have to take down, and let me repeat this, He's going to have to take down the American economy, because as long as the American economy yet remains the #1 economy in the world, it's going to be a hindrance, a stumbling block to the one world antichrist economic system. So now, with that said, I just want to point out very quickly that there is an organization that's known as the World Economic Forum, who is bringing about who is being openly orchestrating, openly advocating for this one world economic system, and by the United States being the only capitalistic nation left in the world, then we remain a hindrance. Let me just, I want to just stick a pin right here, and then I want to just give you a brief, quick illustration of what I'm talking about. Now, as you can see from this image, this is an actual picture or screenshot from this year's annual 2022 World Economic Forum. And if you can see sitting here at this at this podium, you can see representative government leaders from around the world, literal leaders from around the world, and also there are also business leaders that are in attendance, major business and corporation leaders who are in attendance, and their main goal, and in fact, you can go and look this up and see for yourself on their about page, in their World Economic Forum, the Great Reset about page. What they openly advocate for a great reset of the world's economic system, and they're openly advocating for this. And we have to understand that it's the spirit of Antichrist that is behind it, the invisible spirit that is behind this activity to bring about a one world economic system. But right now, the United States has stood in the way, because the United States is the only remaining, or the one remaining major capitalistic society of all the major industrial nations left in the world. All the rest of the world is primarily either socialist or communist, and United States remains the one superpower who remain a free market economy, and that free market economy is standing in the way from this socialist one world government economic system. And we have to understand, and I know I'm going on and on about it, but it's very important that I drive this point home, and to the point where you're motivated rather to go and do some more research for yourselves about this, because it's an invisible spirit that's literally operating in the world right now. And I just want to say this, but since I'm already being controversial, I just want to make this one last controversial note, and that there was a lot of angst, a lot of hatred, a lot of disdain toward President Trump, and he brought a lot of that upon himself, of course. But there's one thing that has gone under the radar that the media failed to emphasize or point out, and that was the fact that Donald Trump emphasize the term America first. Now, what does that mean, America first? It means that America wanted to remain a nationalist country versus a globalist country. Now, let me repeat that. There are two different schools of thought when it comes to world governments, and when it comes to this world economic great reset, was what they want to call it, is that they want to bring about a globalist movement, which means, or in a globalist economy, which means a one world economy. But you have a nation that's saying that we're going to be America first, meaning we're going to be a nationalist, meaning we're going to remain or want to maintain our national sovereignty, and we don't want to be a part of this globalist economic system, right? Now follow me. So by maintaining this mantra of being America first, or being a nationalist economy, maintaining America's economic sovereignty, and not being a part of this globalist agenda. What's happening then is that America yet remains that major stumbling block to bringing about this world economic one world great reset. And I'm a firm believer. And of course, you can comment in the comments and challenge me. But if you're going to challenge me, I want you to make sure you have your homework done. I want to make sure you have your facts and your ducks in a row. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a firm believer that the reason why for all those years that during the first 3 years especially the first 3 years of the presidency, that there was so much disdain and so much hatred, I believe, is largely had to do with the fact that he wanted to maintain America's national sovereignty, and not want to be a part of this globalist agenda. And I want you to just understand it, that regardless of what you think of the individual persons, that there's a spirit behind. That's what I want to leave you with. There's a spirit behind it. There's a spirit of Antichrist behind it. And so now the United States has an administration that's pro-globalist. So we went from a president on administration that was nationalistic and America first, was anti-globalist, to now we have an administration that's openly advocating the globalist talking points. You have to understand, and unless you have discernment, unless you study, prophecy, unless you understand what's happening from the standpoint of the book of Daniel, for an example, and the book of Revelation, unless you have that level of discernment, you will hear the language that they use and not be able to discern and not be able to connect the dots. This is the reason why I'm emphasizing this. This is the reason why I believe that chapter 10 of the book of Daniel is so important, and why I believe that it's so important that we understand and get a discernment and get a grasp of this unseen warfare, because everything is happening for a reason. The world is heading towards a crescendo. And the book of Daniel has given us a preview, a glimpse into what's happening, why it's happening, and what's going to be the final result. And so I'm going to just stop right there, and I'm going to just want to make one final point. So I just want to reiterate that this idea of an unseen spiritual war that's taking place all around us, that's impacting the affairs of nations and governments, that's or being orchestrated in the unseen realm and being manifested in the natural realm. And just like we studied about, or we read about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Grecia, they were literal beings who had authority over the kingdoms of Greece and of Persia. And we know from history that Greece under Alexander ultimately conquered the Persians, but it did not happen overnight. There was about a 300-year buildup from the time that Daniel received this vision until the time where Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in 332 BC. And we have to understand that there was events that were taking. Remember, I talked earlier about prophetic stepping stones and prophetic milestones, and this is exactly again what happened, because there was a whole entire history of if you study like Greek history, or of the country of Greek and their history that led up to Alexander conquering the Persians, that there was an entire history, but there was a spirit being orchestrating that history that was leading up to a specific ultimate goal, which was the defeat of the Persian Empire. And we have to understand that same principle, that same concept, that same warfare that took place back then is happening literally right now as we speak. And as believers, we need to have discernment. We need to be able to discern the signs of the times. We need to be able to know what, who, what, why, where, and how things are happening in the world. And we cannot reiterate or regurgitate, I should say, the world's narrative, because by doing so, we actually are playing into the enemy's hands, because the world cannot understand these type of spiritual things because they are carnal minded, and these spiritual things, the Bible tells us, are spiritually discerned, and we have to be able to understand prophecy to be able to understand exactly what's happening in the world today. And so if we don't get anything else out of this lesson, I would like for you to understand and get out of this idea of personality politics as we begin to evaluate what's happening in the world, because there's so much more, there's so much more of a bigger picture that's happening in the world than just our partisan personality likes and dislikes. And so with that, I just want to close today's lesson and today's study. And I hope you got something out of that. I hope it helped you to be able to understand. There's so much more. There's so much more information. As a matter of fact, if you really would like to get more information about this unseen realm, I would highly recommend a book by Dr. Michael Heiser called The Unseen Realm, who does a phenomenal job. Actually, probably one of the best scholarly works on this subject that I've come across. And I'm going to put a link in the description for Dr. Heiser's book, and I highly recommend it. He gives so much more insight into this study. So with that said, may God bless, and may you have a blessed week.